Molly, thanks so much for being on the program today. I really found your book, Spellbound, interesting, nourishing in a lot of ways, challenging in some ways. And of course, here at Ministry Watch, we write a lot about celebrity preachers and the fall of celebrity preachers. So this whole idea of charisma and celebrity, the similarities and the differences are fascinating to me and have somewhat of a professional interest. So, given that, my first question to be, how do you define charisma and how would you differentiate it or compare it to celebrity?
Well, I really appreciate this chance to be on your show for all the reasons you mentioned. And the challenge of defining charisma is part of why I found the topic so interesting. I think in our everyday speech, it's often a term that we punt to when we're observing a dynamic between a leader and followers that we can't quite make sense of. We can't figure out what this leader is offering, that these people are eating up. We're perplexed. And so we gesture with this word charisma and leave it a bit vague. When I went into the project, at least as far as politics is concerned, or trying to account for the hold that a particular pastor might have over his congregation, I think I confused charisma with charm and celebrity. Charm being a kind of interpersonal magic that we associate with that person who is just brilliant at working the room in a cocktail party, who looks at you and engages you immediately, makes you feel that you are the only person in the room, as people famously said of Bill Clinton, right? Celebrity, I think, is a modern media phenomenon that is premised on this false sense of intimacy that fans feel they have with the famous person based on snippets they get of that person's life through the media. Charisma, I think, is something different. Partly, I came to this conclusion because so many of the leaders I found myself writing about were not particularly charming, at least not in a way that was universally agreed. I expected to be writing about people who were ingenious in their oratorical skills, really good looking, had great sex appeal. And here and there, that was true. But for the most part, the people I wrote about were very polarizing. As many or more observers found them repulsive, repellent, as found them attractive. And that polarizing reaction, I think, is actually what is most characteristic of charisma. The core of charisma is a particular kind of storytelling. It's the ability to invite potential followers into a new narrative of what their life means and how it connects with some bigger transcendent story. And it gives the follower a kind of paradoxical mix of sense of control. Okay, I finally know what's happening in my life, the point of all my struggles, but also security. I'm handing over ultimate power to this higher authority. And I try to tell the story of that dynamic and the particular shape it takes in different historical eras and how it's intertwined with charisma in the New Testament sense, because the book's also a chronicle of that biblical idea and the expression of gifts of the Spirit and different ways in which American Christians look for the presence of the Holy Spirit, and the way that story is not separate from the story of charisma as we use it to describe leaders. The two are tangled up.
Well, Molly, you've opened up a can of worms, or let me say it another way. You have caught more fish than we can fry in the very small amount of time than that we have here. But I want to explore maybe, or at least touch on a couple of the ideas that you've already introduced here, and that is charisma, celebrity, and charm. They're different things. It seems to me what I'm hearing you say and what I'm getting from your book, and I would invite you to correct me if I'm wrong, is that charisma has much more to do with the relationship. It's almost the interstitial material between the person and the audience. It's the key characteristic of charisma is not it's almost the fire between the two rather than a particular characteristic of one or the other. In other words, the subject or the audience of the subject. Whereas charm might be something that I possess. I'm either charming or I'm not charming. You might not be vulnerable to my charms if I am charming, but it is something that I either possess or don't possess. And but there's clearly some overlap between those. I mean, you take someone. I think about a Rick Warren, for example, who is a person who has great oratorical skills, and he has but he's also personally charming. I mean, I know Rick a bit. I've been in his presence. He's personally charming and a guy you want to be with. Whereas opposed someone Tim Keller, and I know a little bit. He's got a very different vibe about him. I mean, he's an introvert. He's not charming in the conventional sense of the word. I don't know if I've got a question here or not, but am I anywhere close to understanding the similarities and the distinctions between these ideas and concepts?
You're right that they're connected. I do think that, I mean, both charm and charisma require two parties, right? You can't be charming or charismatic by yourself in a mirror. Charisma, I think, really resides in the story that the person is telling. And so while it absolutely is connected in important ways to the leader himself or herself, it can travel. And I mean, this really came home to me when I dug into the history of the early Mormon church. And, Joseph Smith, to some people, we have sources that recount encounters with him that convey a powerful sense of personal magnetism. He was tall, good looking, he had these electric blue eyes. A convert would talk about just shaking his hand and feeling the Holy Spirit thrill her, from the crown of her head to the soles of her feet. But other people encountered Joseph Smith and found him to be this clownish charlatan, right? Not charming in the least. And then we have the interesting evidence of thousands of new converts who never encountered him personally, but learned about the Book of Mormon and the story of Joseph Smith's revelation from missionaries. And they uproot their lives, at a distance of thousands of miles, moving from the United Kingdom to Nauvoo, Illinois, right? This scrappy little place on the banks of the Mississippi. Now, what's going on there? Where does the charisma reside? Clearly, Joseph Smith is a crucial part of this, but the charisma is in the story. And I would suggest to you that a major reason why you may find Rick Warren charming in person is because in some important way, you buy into the story he is telling about the church planting movement that he envisions, the kind of revival that he prays for, and that his story grabs you in a way that maybe Tim Keller's didn't. I mean, I think maybe a more striking example would be Bill Clinton. Because he is someone who people so often cite as charismatic and charming. But if you are in that room, at his fundraising event, being charmed by Bill Clinton, I guarantee it's because you have already bought into his story. And he was and remains a very polarizing figure, right? I mean, as many or more Americans find him to be immoral and, a sort of oleaginous, untrustworthy character. And they would, if they were faced with, a conversation with Clinton, they would find it to be manipulative and unpleasant and not charming at all. So I think there's a dynamic that is upstream of the experience of charm. And that's what I'm trying to describe in talking about charisma.
Well, that's a helpful distinction and corrective for my thinking, and I'm grateful for that. Speaking of story, let's talk about some of the stories that you recount in the book. You've already mentioned Joseph Smith. I want to back up even farther than that. Near the beginning of the book, you talk about Anne Hutchinson. Can you tell our listeners who Anne Hutchinson is and why you felt like that she was, a good place to start and someone that you come back to throughout the book?
I wanted to start in that first generation of Puritans, in part because to me, the story of charisma and the intertwining of New Testament charisma with charismatic leadership is really a story about the aftermath of the Reformation. And it's a story about the way in which, prior to the Reformation, the Catholic Church and the kind of ecosystem of medieval Christendom had means for managing the persistent human desire to connect with the divine, to have direct experience of the divine and a sense of a personal role in God's story. And this is not to suggest that, there's no dissent or turmoil in the medieval period. Of course there is, but there's this way in which the Reformation busts that open and anoints the personal desire for that personal relationship with the divine that I think really lands in a powerful and influential way on American shores in that first generation of Puritans, and especially in the person of Anne Hutchinson, who, while her peers, the elites in her community, deem her a heretic, in many ways, I think she was simply ahead of her time and captured in her message to her followers that you don't have to, sit meekly at the feet of ministers and constantly scrutinize your diary for signs that you are among the elect, but rather you can expect through your engagement with scripture and really a real interior experience of the Holy Spirit, you can expect to get a definitive message from the divine that you are among the saved. And I think that story, it was so destabilizing and scary to the elites because of the way in which it challenged their authority, did this kind of end run around institutional power and hierarchy. But it's a story that even if they tamped it down in the short term by banishing her and making it so costly to follow her, they couldn't extinguish the fundamental, the core of her message. Mm-hmm. I think it shows up again and again in different ways later in American history.
I'm going to skip a good bit of your book, and you skip over a number of leaders that I would have thought might have played a more prominent role. Like, for example, Jonathan Edwards. You mentioned you mentioned Whitefield, but not so much Edwards in your book. And I do want to come back to that idea because I'm curious about how you chose to put in your book and who and how you chose to leave out. But I want to fast forward. I want to table that question for a moment and fast forward to somebody that you did spend a fair amount of time on, and that's Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson is another one of these characters. Now we're into the political realm as opposed to Anne Hutchinson, more in the religious realm, who possesses this quality of charisma. Today, maybe superficially, we might call him among America's first populist politicians, and we see populism sort of ebb and flow over the years. I mean, we see Huey P. Long and maybe even Donald Trump in this century, but Andrew Jackson would have probably been an early manifestation of populism that is peculiar to America. Can you talk a little bit about who he is and why you chose to include him in your book?
He's in the period of American history that I call the era of the conquerors. And I mean that both in the physical military sense of the desire pervasive among European Americans in the early Republic to really conquer this continent and stamp it with their presence. But I also mean it in the metaphysical sense. And this is why that section of the book also talks about Joseph Smith, and it talks about teenage women who made their living as spiritualist trance speakers and offered a vision of kind of conquering beyond death, because I think those are two sides of the same coin. Andrew Jackson is a great example of someone whose personal presence, I think, was polarizing, or at least provoked very mixed reviews. We know from primary sources created by eyewitnesses who heard him speak that many people perceived him, when they heard him, as an orator in person, as very awkward, not particularly winning. But this is the early 19th century, right? So the proportion of Americans who get to hear a national political candidate in person is very small. And I think Andrew Jackson benefited from the early 19th century kind of romantic myth-making media machine, if you will.
Hmm.
And the stories that, I think he cultivated and his supporters cultivated about his war record, and this kind of inflated and romanticized vision of his role in the final stage of the War of 1812, as well as kind of the implications for his conquering past for this victory over the continent. I think that's a story that had a real magic through media, through barroom tavern songs, and also vivid accounts of his physicality, right? So if you were an American in the late 1820s, early 1830s, perhaps you'd never seen Andrew Jackson in person, but you'd probably read accounts of his his suffering service for his men in wartime, and this kind of power, this electric depth in his eyes. I was so struck in my research by the frequent references to this kind of mysterious, smoldering, mystical, like almost pagan power in the eyes of romantic heroes like Jackson. Not just him, right? This shows up in the kind of posthumous biographies of the Shawnee chief Tecumseh as well. And I think it conveys that charismatic relationship, that degree to which a lot of this is about people, potential followers, projecting a hunger for a certain kind of leader who seems to embody a divine supernatural power and is inviting you into this story of what America is destined to be.
Well, I did, since you mentioned Tecumseh and you mentioned that quality of his eyes, you use a French expression to capture that, and my French is weak, so I'm not sure I'm going to be a coup d'oeil. Is that
Coup d'oeil, coup d'oeil.
coup d'oeil? Okay, there we go. Sorry about that. But you use that expression, which kind of doesn't have a perfect translation. It's into English, but to sort of capture that idea of that quality of their eyes. And you mentioned Napoleon, you mentioned Tecumseh, you mentioned Andrew Jackson in this context, and I am wondering, therefore, you focus mostly on how charisma has shaped America, but this is not a peculiarly American quality per se. What is it about charisma American style that might be different from charisma Napoleon style? Or I mean, I guess you could. Tecumseh is an American. He's one of the first peoples, but he comes from a different um, milieu, ethic, ethos than the westward expansion manifest destiny Americans that Andrew Jackson, for example, might characterize. Is charisma a human quality? Is it a distinctively American quality?
I think you've hit on one of the core dilemmas of the work of doing history, and it's a reason I love the discipline, but it's a constant challenge. And that is, on the one hand, I'm interested in drawing forth some true observations about universal features of humanity, and part of why I'm so compelled by these earlier centuries of history is because I do see these continuities. And you're right, charisma is not, even if we're focused on America, we have to pay attention to the international context. And I write about Napoleon, I write about Hitler, who looms so large over how Americans are thinking about charisma in the 20th century. At the same time, I'm suggesting in my book that to understand charisma in a particular era, we have to be very sensitive to context. And the kind of charismatic story that resonates with Americans in a particular era has everything to do with the specific desires and anxieties of that era. A broad comment I can make about what's different about the American context is, I think, the relative weakness of institutions. especially compared to other countries in kind of Western Europe and Canada, where we might find many parallel developments in other ways. I think there is in the DNA of the American experiment a suspicion of institutions. And it is a quality of American culture that perhaps has given charismatic leaders a greater influence generally, because charismatic leaders, for the most part, define themselves in reference to institutions. Perhaps they ultimately have success in taking over those institutions and transforming them in their image. And I think only by doing that does a charismatic leader have any lasting power. But charisma is often the redoubt of the weak, of people who, for whatever reason, don't have access to centers of institutional power, military authority. So we often see charismatic movements rising up on the political margins among, women, people of color, people who, for whatever reason, are not, allowed into that center. Now, there is an exception in the kind of arc I trace of American history, and that is the immediate period after World War II, in which the West is so traumatized by Adolf Hitler and what is evidently possible in the hands of a fascist demagogue who can manipulate the people. And experts, scholars, journalists use the word charisma to describe what they saw Hitler doing. They vow, in a sense, never again. We cannot. We have to stamp out charisma from democracy. It's not compatible with democracy. And so there is among Americans this brief period, frankly, when they are interested in the stories that experts are telling. They're more inclined to trust experts in universities, in government, who also have a story to tell. And it's not so much that the experts are themselves personally charismatic, right? I write about Robert McNamara, the architect of the early Vietnam War, Kennedy's Secretary of Defense, and he's not in his person charismatic. In fact, people who knew him said he had this ability to direct your attention elsewhere, away from him, right? It's an anti-charisma, but there's a story that people like McNamara are telling. Trust the technocrats, trust science, trust the experts. And there's this period where that has resonance, but that erodes for reasons that partly have to do with the experts screwing it up, and I think betraying the opportunity they had.
Well, that for me, that was an interesting and ironic section of your book, partly because I came out of the business world and I had read, Tom Peters and Robert McNamara, the best and the brightest, the Whiz Kids, that book that sort of chronicled the rise of the Robert McNamara and the GM crowd. And to me, what was interesting and ironic about that is that they were in some ways, as you say, a reaction to this notion of charisma, but then they became gurus themselves. I mean, in fact, you title that section "Gurus." They became they might have been anti-charismatic, but then they created this mythology and this story, as you say, around themselves that has now, of course, I think, today resulted in yet another backlash. And sometimes, in fact, I wonder if the populist resurgence of the Tea Party of 2010 and Donald Trump of the late 2010s and 2020s is in some ways not a reaction to the tyranny of what some people call the tyranny of experts, that which itself was a reaction to an earlier form of populism. Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think it sounds overly simplistic, but there is some truth to thinking of American history as action and reaction and a kind of pendulum swing. And there's this way in which maybe humans in general do this, certainly Americans do. We tend to overcorrect. Whatever was wrong in the previous era, we swing wildly in the other direction. But I would add more broadly that I think when people talk about secularization, we make a mistake when we limit that word's meaning to the fate of organized religion. I think the heart of secularization is the erosion of American trust in institutions in general, and our investment in communities and a sense of duty to institutions. And that is, that erosion is something that we've seen across the board. And when pollsters survey people, not just on their trust in government or organized religion, but media, even their own workplace, to what degree do you trust your boss? We've seen those numbers really decline. And I think that has made possible a real authority for charismatic leaders in our own time.
Well, and Molly, correct me if I'm wrong here, but it seems to me that in that character, in that particular, this book is in many is of a piece with your previous book, Apostles of Reason, which was in some ways a diagnosis, an explication of, an analysis of that crisis of confidence in institutions, specifically within the realm of religion. Am I right to see that connection?
Yeah, that's interesting. I think you are right. I guess I'm broadly interested in questions of intellectual authority and why people trust certain people, certain traditions, certain institutions to tell them what their lives mean, and don't trust others. So you're absolutely right to see that connection.
And I know you. I'm going to ask this question, even though I know you're probably going to be loath to answer it. But as an academic, as an intellectual, as a scholar, my guess is that you probably want to shy away a bit from the didactic, the what's the moral of your story kind of a thing. And yet, I can't help but ask this question anyway. Given all of what you've written here, this deep dive into charisma, especially as it manifests itself in the American experiment. What would you want people to take away from this analysis? I mean, does it provide lessons for us? Do you care whether it provides lessons or not?
Oh,
you
sure,
know,
I
it,
care. Yeah, I mean, I think any historian who doesn't care is shirking their duty. I guess there's a few things. One is that I think we have a tendency to exaggerate the degree to which our moment in history is special and unique. Yes, it's true that the 21st century is radically different in some ways. Much of my book is about the relationship of the latest media technology to the messages that charismatic leaders are trying to propound. So of course, our social media, TikTok era is different. But I think we have this tendency to think that there's a sort of a deep chasm, I'll say, between ourselves and previous centuries. And the lesson of my book is that, in fact, there are these abiding human hungers. I think humans are intrinsically religious creatures, and we look for a connection to a transcendent story. We are wired to worship, and if that impulse is not landing in a traditional organized religion, it will land somewhere else. I'll say also that I think there are lessons here for navigating in our own lives and becoming a little bit more aware of when our own relationship with a leader is maybe becoming unhealthy. I would say that what marks out the kinds of people I describe as gurus in my last section of the book is a tendency to tell you, the follower, I am the sole gateway to truth. I am unveiling for you a hidden reality that other people don't have access to, and you should trust me as the real arbiter of what's real and what's not. And often gurus will kind of stand adjacent to a religious tradition. They'll kind of riff on it, but they make themselves the boss, the arbiter. And I think that is a warning sign, right? The sign of a healthy leader is someone who is inviting you into a story, for sure. Christianity, if we want to take the church context, Christianity is the story, right? So any good pastor or evangelist is inviting you into that story, but he is not making himself the gatekeeper. He is rather connecting you with a broader tradition, with the huge range of 2 millennia of resources, a sense of the global church. He is submitted himself to an accountability structure. And I do think that American evangelicalism has perhaps a special vulnerability to charismatic guru figures, because in general, it's a religious culture with a fairly weak ecclesiology. This isn't to say that abuse of power doesn't happen in other terrible ways in more ecclesiological forms of Christianity. Of course, original sin will manifest everywhere. But I do think that there's this way in which the structure or lack of structure in evangelicalism makes evangelicals particularly vulnerable to those personal claims to authority.
Right. Well, I know I can certainly bear witness to that in the work that we do here at
Absolutely.
MinistryWatch. Molly, we've got to land this airplane here in a minute, but I can't resist asking you a couple of questions. One is the question that I tabled earlier, which is, how did you decide who goes in the book and who doesn't go in the book? I mentioned, for example, that Whitfield, yes; Jonathan Edwards, no. Billy Graham, I was not really profiled. Tecumseh was, which might, Ann Hutchinson, yes. So I mean, it's not that I would want to leave out anybody that you put in the book, but I was a little bit surprised whenever I didn't see some of the folks that I expected to see in the book. And help me understand your thinking and how you made that decision process.
Yeah, of course. I mean, everyone I meet has a list of people that they wish I had included, and there's even though the book is not a short book, it was like what 450
that's
pages
right.
or something.
Oh, that's right.
It's limited. It's still quite limited. You're right. I'm trying to cover 4 centuries. So part of my criteria was, all right, I want to choose a selection of people I'll call the usual suspects. Historical characters that I think the average reader will definitely expect, has heard of, someone like John F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King, George Washington. But I also want to surprise the reader. I want to include some less familiar figures who help me trace the shape of these historical eras. So, as I began my research and I started to discern patterns in each of the 5 historical eras I profile, I needed to think about, which personal stories will help me pull out the thread of that era and really convey a comprehensive, a picture that, I shouldn't say comprehensive, but rather a picture that kind of hangs together, right? But it's any act of teaching a class, putting together a syllabus, or writing a book. It always involves leaving out as many people or more as you'd like to include. I will say Jonathan Edwards was not a hard decision in that, I mean, he in many ways was the theorist of the First Great Awakening and a fully comprehensive story of George Whitfield's career would include him as a kind of theological architect. But he was kind of famously not compelling, right? Like he was infamous, I should say, for staring at the bell rope in the back of the church and preaching in a monotone. Now, the content of his famous sermon, "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God," has a kind of an independent charisma. I mean, I had this fascinating conversation with a colleague who recounted a meeting of totally secular religious historians at a conference. And one of their colleagues stood up and simply read "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God." And this room full of, agnostic and atheist historians were all stricken, right? Just because of the power of the words.
Yeah.
So yes, in a perfect world, I would write about everyone, but it's a limited genre, and you've got to at some level prioritize the narrative.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I understand that. Well, speaking of narrative, and we've also mentioned your earlier book, Apostles of Reason. Since when that book came out, I live in Charlotte. You live in Chapel Hill, or at least you teach at Chapel Hill. I don't know where you live, but I drove over there. We had a conversation about that book. And now, of course, this book, we're a decade later having this conversation. There's been a personal spiritual journey in your own life. Do you mind talking about that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. And certainly if listeners want the long version, I've told the internet the long version in various rambling podcast interviews. I grew up totally secular. I was, I think a scholar. I became a scholar of religion in part as a way of kind of sidling up alongside the thing that I wanted. I was always quite clear in my own mind about being envious of religious people, but could not really get there myself, had made a couple of failed efforts to get myself churched, and was not even able to confidently say I believed in God. So 3 years ago, I was still in that state of kind of dissatisfied, but essentially apathetic agnosticism. I do some freelance journalism. So I was working on a magazine article about a Southern Baptist megachurch in my area, the Summit Church, pastored by J.D. Greer. And it was meant to be just an ordinary magazine profile, kind of about the Southern Baptist Convention context and all of that. And the short version is that J.D. evangelized me. And in the email correspondence that followed our interview, he surfaced questions that I realized I had about the historical claims Christians make that I'd really never investigated. And to my shame, even though I'm a historian of Christianity, I think I had kind of absorbed from the ether in my time in graduate school what I now see as a totally out of date, dismissive idea of what we can know about the life of Jesus and the circumstances of his resurrection. And that there was this wealth of really quite excellent scholarship that I just hadn't familiarized myself with. I think, too, I was more open to the claims of Christianity because I was at a place of being a bit disillusioned with the prevailing kind of secular progressive worldview that dominates my world in secular academia. And JD and I became friends. He connected me also with Tim Keller, and had a couple of Zoom conversations with Tim. And he was dying of cancer, of course, but that man was an evangelist till his dying breath. Mm-hmm. And so, I had a very intense summer of doing a lot of reading, not just in the scholarship, but I also rediscovering the Gospels in a powerful new way, really seeing them as primary source historical documents that were far more compelling than I had realized. And then in that, Jesus did start to kind of come alive for me, especially in the Gospel of Mark, especially in his encounters in healing people on the specific and very strange way he interacts with each individual as a human. And I continue, despite always thinking of myself as a giant high church snob who, if I ever became a Christian, it would be some respectable form, Anglican or Catholic or something. I continued to go to this megachurch. And I think for me, the absolutely stripped down, straightforward lyrics on the screen, very biblical 40-minute sermon presenting the gospel in this relentless way. That's what I needed, because I think those more liturgical contexts, while they appealed to me aesthetically, they gave me a lot of things to focus on that aren't Jesus. I didn't have any, despite praying for some sort of mystical experience, what evangelicals call a real born again experience. I certainly didn't have that. But I did get to the point where the intellectually honest thing to do was to admit that I had operated, even though I thought of myself as a very open-minded person who was really open to claims of religious people, I actually operated on the basis of a pretty firm anti-supernaturalist bias and moved through the world as if it's a closed universe. And the more I investigated and thought about it, the more I realized I didn't really have warrant for those assumptions. And if I was willing to suspend my disbelief in the miraculous, the Christian explanation for the evidence around the resurrection was the best explanation on offer. So that's how I got to the surprising point of being in the tank on stage at the giant mothership campus of Summit in August of 2022, getting baptized by the former president of the Southern Baptist Convention.
Well, that's a remarkable story, Molly, and I'm grateful for you sharing it. I'm trying to do some math in my head. Tim passed away when? Was it before or after August of 2022?
He died in May of 2023.
2020.
And
So
he
So you were able to communicate with him, and
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I told him, immediately afterward, and we corresponded about it. And then I learned that the first public interview I did about this was with Colin Hansen and his Gospelbound podcast, which
right.
aired maybe 2 weeks before Tim died.
Mm.
And I heard from his close friends that he saw that, he watched that video, and I'm really glad that I got to convey to him the difference he'd made in my life.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I can see how that would be very meaningful. Well, listen, Molly, I've kept you longer than I intended. Let me just say again, I'm grateful for your book, Spellbound: How Charisma Shaped American History from the Puritans to Donald Trump. I'm still digesting it, as you can tell probably by the nature of my questions that are in some ways a little unfocused, because you've even though I study this topic and study people in the church world who could easily, maybe in a book that was twice or three times as long, have been characters in your book. This is a complicated topic, and I'm grateful for you bringing an academic's discipline, as a historian's discipline, to this topic, because I do think that it will be helpful for the church and for those of us who care about this American experiment. So thank you.
Well, thanks so much for having me on.